Hello, and welcome to the 11th episode of SOL's 2023 webinar series featuring presentations on ecological land care. My name is Christine, and I am the Special Projects Lead with SOL, and I'm happy to be your host today. I live in Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this webinar series and much of SOL's work is made possible by the generous support of Gaia College, Canada's leading college for professional development and diploma courses in ecological land care. SOL is also supported by its members, so if you haven't become a member yet, I invite you to do so. At the end of this presentation, we will have 15 minutes or so for discussion. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I can read them out. And just a reminder that we are recording this episode and it will be available on SOL's website and YouTube channel in the next few days. Finally, for today's presentation, I'm very pleased to introduce Megan Jacqueline, Conservation Coordinator for the Edmonton and Area Land Trust. Megan will be presenting the Pollinator Garden at the Smith Blackburn Homestead in Alberta. Welcome, Megan, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk about this, and I hope that everyone enjoys it very much. I'll give you just a quick overview of what I'm planning to talk about. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Edmonton and Area Land Trust, as I understand that a lot of the audience here is from across the country and may not be familiar with us. I'll talk briefly about private land conservation and give a little bit of context to the area in which the pollinator garden was placed. And then, of course, talk about the pollinator garden itself, why we built it, how we built it, and then talk a little bit about how you can also support native conservation of plants and wildlife in your backyard or in natural spaces as well. So I'll start off with an acknowledgement that the Edmonton and Area Land Trust and the Smith Blackburn Homestead is located on Treaty 6 territory and Métis homelands. This is a traditional and present gathering place and traveling route for many Indigenous peoples. EALT's work to conserve and protect that land continues the legacy of stewardship that has been done since time immemorial. So to introduce EALT, you should know that we are a local land trust that focuses within about 150 kilometers of Edmonton, Alberta. And so our primary purpose is to conserve nature in that region and engage people and communities in land conservation and stewardship. And the pollinator garden is also one way that we are engaging people and communities in that conservation and stewardship as well. Ultimately, we want to see a wide network of natural spaces that are conserved for perpetuity for people and for wildlife. And we want to work with other organizations to help us achieve those goals as well. So there are sort of three steps to what we do to help conserve land and conserve natural spaces. The first one is the actual land securement. So that means that people who have the ability may donate land to us, we may purchase land, or we may place a conservation easement on a piece of land owned by someone else. And through any of those different ways, we will essentially limit what can be done on those lands. So we usually limit development and disturbance of that land in order to allow wildlife to thrive there. Once we have done that, we also are sure to steward that land, make sure that we are taking care of it, that it is continuing to be a good place for wildlife and for plants to thrive in as well. And we make sure to reach out to other people to let the public know what we're doing, what they can do, and to work with other organizations to achieve those goals. If any of you are in the Edmonton region or are going to visit, we currently have 17 conservation lands. And as I said, all within about 150 kilometers of Edmonton. Most of these lands are open to the public. They are quite rustic trails and they are for light use only. But if you're interested in somewhere to go out and explore nature, everything that's open to the public does have directions and trail maps on our website, including the Smith Blackburn Homestead, which you can see over to the right side of the image here. The Smith Blackburn Homestead is located just east of Elk Island National Park, which is quite a large conserved area as well. So I will talk very briefly about private land conservation in a fragmented landscape. And this is really just to give you a little bit of a context to why we are protecting land in this area and why we put the pollinator garden where we did as well. So for those of you who may be a little bit less familiar with Alberta, this map shows the different natural regions. The large green section that really fills a good half of the province is the boreal forest ecoregion. And this is mostly uninterrupted forest of both spruce and poplar, and where a lot of logging occurs, but not a lot of human population lives. Further to the south, the yellow represents the grassland, which is dominated primarily by grasses and also agriculture and cattle ranching. And then where we are primarily located and where the Smith-Blackburn Homestead is located is just in the center in the Aspen Parkland Natural Region, the light green that's in between those two different regions. This region is really characterized as a transition zone between that boreal forest and the grassland, and it has patches of aspen forest, patches of meadow, and it also happens to be where the vast majority of the human population of Alberta lives. So we do deal with a lot of challenges with impact of human beings, a lot of development on the landscape, a lot of habitat that may be degraded or fragmented. And because of that high population of humans, most of that land is actually privately owned and not very much of it is protected. So that's why, as a land trust, EALT is so focused on this region, trying to make sure that there is a balance where there's also space that is protected for wildlife and light human use as well. So this image shows a little bit about the different ways that we can support both wildlife and plants. So because we have such a high human population, we have so much disturbance in this area, we end up being left with different size patches of natural habitat on the landscape. So the Smith-Blackburn Homestead, it is a big enough space that it can provide habitat for the entire life cycle of, say, smaller animals, as well as plants and pollinators. But when it comes to larger animals, we are providing more of a stepping stone. So moose, bear, they will absolutely use this area, but they will be maybe spending some time there, but also passing through to other areas like Elk Island Park, which is a very large, continuous protected area. And the other thing that we look for when we're protecting land is to try and provide and maintain corridors for wildlife to travel as well. So just so you have a bit of an idea of what we're looking at here, we are expecting to provide continuous habitat or a full life cycle worth of habitat for some creatures, particularly smaller ones that need smaller area. And then we're just providing a place for others to be able to spend time as well, even though the landscape is also broken up. We are, though, reasonably lucky right in the vicinity of the Smith-Blackburn Homestead. It is located within the Beaver Hills Biosphere Reserve, and that particular area is not as disturbed as other parts of this central Aspen Parkland. So we actually are not doing too badly right in this exact area, but we're trying to maintain it by continuing to protect places like the homestead for wildlife to live in. So once we secured the Smith-Blackburn Homestead, and this was actually completed fairly recently in about 2020, it is then our responsibility to steward that land. Many people think that natural areas will just take care of themselves, and certainly to an extent that is true. But the trouble is that the areas that we are conserving very, very often have previous human impact, and that impact continues on into the future. So when we have that disturbance, that impact that's continuing, we need to do something to address that so that it doesn't get out of control. And really, the biggest way we see that is through invasive plants. And you can actually see in the picture a volunteer at the Smith-Blackburn Homestead pulling and removing some Canada or creeping thistle that was taking over the landscape. So now I will talk about the pollinator garden and how that really ties in to what we're doing to steward this land and make sure that it is good habitat for wildlife and a good place for people to visit. So this is a map of what the Smith-Blackburn Homestead looks like. It is a portion of a quarter section, and it is, as I said, just about 2 kilometers east of Elk Island National Park. So it's very similar habitat to Elk Island. It is very bumpy terrain left over from the glaciers. There is both forested area covering a lot of it. There is grassland in between. There are a lot of small wetlands and sort of seasonal wetlands across the land. And then there is 2 ends of a small lake up on the north end as well. So we really do see quite a large variety of habitat in this area. Now, this being located within the Beaver Hills Biosphere, it has very typical knob and kettle terrain, so very bumpy and very rocky. This land was homesteaded in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but because of that lumpy terrain, it was not really very suitable for agriculture, which is typical of this biosphere, but it was suitable for cattle ranching. So the primary impact that we now see on this land is the impacts that came from that cattle ranching that occurred. So this is a picture of what we started with when we went to build the pollinator garden. We were essentially recovering an area where an old cattle corral was located. And the trouble with this corral is you gather all the cows in one area for a long time. They spend a lot of time pooping in that one area. There's a lot of invasive plant seeds in their poo. There's a lot of nutrients in their poo. And it's all gathered in this one condensed area. So essentially, we found that a lot of what you can see in this picture is covered by thick invasive grasses, thick invasive plants such as thistle and white cockle. It essentially, there's a lot of it to try and tackle and recover. And when we have that thick cover of all of, 1 or 2 species, we're really limiting the habitat that is available for other native plants. They can't really get in, and our animals that might eat those invasive plants tend to be few and far between. So we're also not providing food for the native wildlife either. So that's what we were looking at. That's where our concerns were coming in. We're wanting to give a place for native plants to be able to reestablish and come back into this area that had been heavily disturbed. So we reached out to local experts. We talked to the Edmonton Native Plant Society, and we were advised to do a couple of different things when it came to building this garden. One of the first things they recommended to us is that we actually remove the topsoil of the area where we wanted to plant the garden and plant the native plants directly into the subsoil. They recommended that we do this because a lot of the native plants for this area are used to growing in conditions that are nutrient poor. Whereas a lot of our introduced invasive species really benefit from both disturbed area, but also very nutrient heavy areas, such as where all this manure was piled by the cattle. So at their recommendations, we removed a layer of topsoil. We planted directly into the subsoil. And then we did some other management of the garden area to both support the plants and to make sure that invasive species could not easily spread back into the garden. One of the things that involved was taking some old tarps and lining the outside edge of the garden with these tarps. This would suppress the ability of weeds to spread back in from the edges into the garden, prevent them from just taking over the garden once more. And then we also put cardboard in between the plants to try and suppress initial weed growth because, of course, we were disturbing that area to begin with. So we were looking at having an area that, if we're not careful, we could have those species come back in. So we put cardboard in between the plants, and then to help contain some of the moisture in that area, we spread mulch in between all the plants and on top of the cardboard and the tarps as well. So here's a few pictures of the process. It took actually quite a large number of loads of mulch to cover the area that of the garden that was planted. And you can see how the tarp was applied down to the edges in this other picture here as well. The tarp, really a big part of it is to prevent weeds like weedy grasses and other plants that can spread by the root from coming back in from the sides and not allowing them to grow back out. So here's a bit of a picture of the garden area The garden is actually behind the old light pole there, and is marked off, but you can kind of see what the landscape looks like that the garden is located within. The grass in this picture has actually been mowed to control weeds somewhat recently, and normally the grass is actually a good meter or so tall. So just so you get a bit of an idea of what you're expecting. But the garden is located in an open meadow that is surrounded by forest and has quite a large wetland on one side as well. Here's a few pictures of the planting in action. We had a number of native plants from a couple of different sources, including the Edmonton Native Plant Society as well. So all species that were planted were native to this region. We planted with a couple of volunteer events with people coming out and planting in, hot summer weather. Here's the planting in action and the planting when finished. So it looks pretty darn barren in this photo. I promise it gets better, but that is the initial start of the garden. And here is the garden in the first year when the mulch has mostly been added, and you can see some of the plants. Still looks a little rough, but it promised that it gets better pretty quickly. Two of the other things, I guess, that we did to help support this garden, we added a lot of natural just logs from the forest amongst the garden as well, with the idea that it would provide some habitat for cavity nesting pollinators, so different insect species, and provide a bit more of those pollinators to the plants as well to help them thrive. So we, went through all the work to build this garden in 2021, but now we need to make sure that those weeds don't make their way back in. This garden is relatively low maintenance, all things considered, but weeds still can access it. So there's a few things that we have been doing. We have been doing 1 or 2 volunteer events every summer since then to remove any invasive weeds that are making their way in. And we also engage a group of volunteers that we call our conservation land stewards as well. And so those conservation land stewards are volunteers that are going out in pairs to the land outside of an organized event, and they will do different stewardship tasks such as removing invasive weeds as well. Sometimes we also try to water some of the plants if it's a particularly hot time, but truly the most maintenance that is needed is removing competing invasive plants. So here's what the garden looks like a lot more recently. You can see that although it did start out looking pretty sad, the plants really did survive and take off quite well. There will always be some maintenance needed, most likely, of this garden. And we want to make sure that we aren't ending up with it getting taken over by weeds. But you can see kind of around the edges how tall the grass is, and there's a lot of white cockle that's speckled in there as well. So you can see that what we had beforehand was quite overwhelming for this area. The long-term hope for this garden is that by providing a place for these native species to thrive, is that they'll also be able to spread back into the landscape around them, and that we'll eventually see fewer of those invasive species and invasive grasses as well that are around the area. But it has been a very great success, and you can see here's a lot of the flowers in bloom. We had planted over 250 individual plants in this garden with volunteers. And really the vast majority of them have done very, very well. So we were very happy to see that. This garden and this land is open to the public year round. So if ever you are in the area and you want to come and visit it, we would absolutely welcome that. And again, you can find directions on our website. If you're interested as well, we're always happy to have more volunteers. So if you're interested in volunteering with this project, either as part of an event or as a conservation land steward, I would encourage you to check out our website as well. But if you're not from the region, or if that doesn't work for you at this moment, there are other things you can do to help conserve these natural spaces as well. So the largest scale way to help is to support the conservation by supporting land trusts like the Edmonton and Area Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy of Canada or other local land trusts in your area. This is a great way to help to combat climate change, protect biodiversity, and is something that we can do sort of on a larger scale to protect wildlife. But if that's not something really within your reach at this moment, there's lots of ways you can help on a smaller scale. So we really stress the more native flowers you can plant, the better. If you're looking at having a garden in your yard, it's not necessarily harmful to have some plants that are not from the region, but be extra careful that you're not introducing invasive plants specifically. And if you can, the more native plants you have, the better, and the more native pollinators and the more diversity you'll be supporting as well. If you can have in a garden a variety of flowers that bloom at different times of year, you'll be providing food at different times of year for different species. Different species come out at different times. And even having a few dandelions around is not the end of the world. Really, the trouble that comes is from invasive plants that end up taking over an area because they have no natural predators, no natural insect predators, nothing that slows them down, and they just take over and create a monoculture. So if you have a handful of dandelions here and there, not too much of a harm is done there. It can be beneficial to employ no mow May. The less you can mow your lawn, the better. And even, if you can have more of a natural garden, even instead of a lawn, that's really the best case scenario. So the more variety, the more natural things you can have, the better that's going to be for wildlife and for pollinators as well. We would encourage you to be cautious of wildflower seed mixes, as those often are not specific to the region that you're in. So it's better to go and specifically ask for species that are native to your area. And it's really important to watch for and remove invasive plants. I know here in Alberta, we have provincially designated invasive species that are known to be major issues and that all landowners are required to remove. I believe there's the same program in other provinces as well. So you can check those lists for what you really need to watch out for and try and remove. It is also beneficial to both leave some bare ground and conserve leaf litter when you can as well. So when we think about our native pollinator species, which people aren't always as familiar with, a lot of them are actually ground nesting insects, and they may just be an individual bee that will just go into find a tunnel in the ground, lay a series of eggs, and leave. Different species will also do that in woody debris as well. So if you can leave some bare ground for those native pollinating insects, and if you can leave any dead woody material as well, those are both valuable things you can do to help support pollinators in a small garden in your home, as well as in natural spaces as well. Finally, you can use a bee hotel as well. We just advise caution when doing this because it is very important to be sure to maintain them. If when you have a hotel at the end of each year, when you're sure that the bees have left, it would be midsummer that they would leave and go out to have their lives, then you'd want to clean out the blocks or replace them to make sure that those blocks do not spread disease. And we do have instructions on how to do that on our website if you're interested. And also, it would be good to make sure you're using the right size of tunnels for your region and that you're using the right materials. It's important to have breathable materials like wood or paper. And it's good to note that many commercially available hotels are not suitable. So check out the instructions on our website. They are applicable to Alberta. They are probably similar for other provinces in Alberta. The key to note is that most of our solitary bees are very small. And a lot of the times the commercially available hotels are really more designed for places like California, which have very large solitary bees. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you decide to go this route, make sure you're cleaning them out so that diseases cannot spread to the next year's occupants. But that's another way, particularly in an urban environment where a lot of natural habitat is lost, that you can help to support native pollinators. Perfect. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the Smith Pollinator Garden.
Okay, well, Megan, thank you very much. I love when there are images that show the before and after, or at least before and in progress. We know that these sites are always evolving and changing. And so that maybe leads me to my first question. Although before I ask it, I encourage anybody who has a question, they can either put it in the chat or raise your hand, put a symbol up, and I can unmute you that way. But I'll start and just by asking you a question, and that is on a personal level, what brought you to this type of work? What makes you interested in conservation? And not only conservation, because as you were saying, with fragmentation and degradation, sometimes it is about regeneration. So what brings you to this type of work that you do?
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question. And really, I think for me, it does come from being involved in living and playing outdoors with my family for my whole life. So I have been avid canoeer for my entire life, and we would go camping. And I think that really gave me a love of nature. And so when there's a lot of things, like challenges that our wild spaces face, and being able to contribute in some way to help conserve them is very meaningful for me. We can't fix everything all in one go, but I do get to be both part of that conservation work and also just on a daily basis get to go out and enjoy nature at the same time. So it is really a rewarding place for me to be and to be able to contribute and see that I can help conserve these natural spaces. So
Well, and I guess when you talk about the volunteers, the land stewards, they also too are getting that experience.
yeah.
And in a way, so that is part of your public engagement outreach strategies to involve people on site doing the work and helping with the workload, I guess. But can you tell me, are they involved at all with any citizen science projects while they're there? Are you monitoring any of the species now that the plants are growing? Are you doing any surveying of what is visiting and coming to the pollinator garden?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. At this point, the conservation land stewards specifically, it is certainly more stewardship based, and part of that comes from the fact that we did bring in this program to help address capacity. We have 17 lands. At the moment, we have 6 staff, and we can only do so much. So really, a big part of it is that those volunteers go out and they help manage things. But there is still a part of it that is monitoring as well. They will regularly let us know, if they're seeing new patches of invasive weeds, the report on anything that might be wrong that we might need to address, those kind of things. When it comes to pollinators using the garden, I would say not maybe the conservation land stewards so much. We do have a separate citizen science program as well. And that has a variety of specific wildlife monitoring programs, one of which is butterfly surveying. And butterfly surveying, we did just start this year. And we did, Smith Blackburn Homestead is one of the locations that we have started it at. So it's only been the first year of that. So I don't really have any maybe comparison information for previous years. But that is something that we plan on continuing in perpetuity as well. And that may be able to inform us of any changes that we're seeing on the landscape as well. So I would say a combination of those conservation land stewards, maybe more monitoring things like invasive species. And then we do have those butterfly surveys, and we may very well expand to others in the future as well. But those are kind of where we're currently at for the monitoring, more surveying of what we're seeing in the garden.
Hmm. Yeah, because I find a real big, strong motivator for myself, but I think for a lot of people is when you actually do see what is showing up, and you just fall in love with the bumblebees or the butterflies.
Yeah.
So another question I have is related to, you said that there are 250 plants that you put in,
Mhm.
and do you know how many species that represents? Just
I'm not sure off the top of my head. We do have the list, which I can go in and get and share with you later. But I'm afraid, yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know. But we did put a pretty decent diversity of plants in there.
yeah, yeah, it showed some diversity, but I just was curious to know about that.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is of interest to others, and which will be interesting, you'll know in a few years, is whether when you say that the seed source from the garden that you've planted, if that becomes a seed bank that spreads and
Yeah.
controls some of those other grasses and invasive plants. So that's something that is so important. But I wonder if there's any future plan that you have, even on that homestead property.
Mhm.
Would you ever want to have a second plot as well, or garden, or is this central one going to be the one that you hope just spreads outward?
I think most likely we would stick with the center garden area that we have at the moment. We are, it's not the only sort of restoration based work that we're doing in that area. We did plant as well a series of small trees and shrubs kind of on the edges of the garden as well, to sort of promote some more natural habitat, taking over the invasive species there as well. And we do use other methods, like this year for the first time at this location, we did have target browsing goats come in as well. And
Oh,
they
wow.
heavily browsed all the invasive weeds that were outside, right surrounding the
Oh,
garden. So there are other factors that come into play. I do think that the garden itself, we most likely will stick to that spot that it's in at the moment. But they're very well, it's not just, it's never just one project. There are other things that will interact as well. So things like having those goats come in and browse the invasive weeds, that helps also give a space for some of those native plants to hopefully spread once those invasive weeds are controlled a little bit better. So
and where did the goats come from?
so we contract someone with BOD Plant Management, which is a fantastic name. And I believe they are centered somewhere in southern Alberta, but they travel all over the province, and they come to a couple of our lands. So
Okay. Well, it's interesting because you have mentioned a few of the partnerships
yeah.
that are involved in this. And how important do you think these partnerships are in land stewardship?
Definitely very, very much so. We work with different people on sort of different projects in different ways. But everything from some lands we will co-own with other organizations and then co-manage with them. Smith Blackburn Homestead is one that we own solely, but we partnered with the Edmonton Native Plant Society to make sure that we were doing the best design for the garden, that had the most chance of success. We're a small organization. We certainly have capacity and knowledge about biological systems, but whenever we can also connect with other people who also have other expertise, we can benefit from that as well. And then, just the more we can work with other people, provide valuable and like correct information to the public too, that is really important to us as well. So in many ways, we partner with lots of organizations. We also do frequently depend on grant funding for projects like this. And the initial funding for this did come from Alberta Eco Trust as well. So those kind of partnerships are also extremely valuable to us and really help us to actually be able to achieve our goals as such a small organization.
So where do you see this garden being in 5 years from now?
Well, I would love to see it flourishing. I know we have a lot of dedicated volunteers who are going to be helping to continue that and to flourish. I know we're going to be planting a few more trees and shrubs this fall as well. So there'll probably be a few things like that where we'll continue to have maintenance, minor changes like this. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it flourishing for many years and really seeing a lot of very healthy native plants growing there. So.
All right. Well, I certainly really enjoyed this presentation. There are people that have put messages in the chat to thank you and are really happy to see how this project is progressing. And yeah, as we know that these are projects in motion, and with all of the different dynamics that come into play, forest fires being one of them. But just luckily, this area is safe for now and just flourishing, as you say, and hopefully will continue to. So with that, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank everyone who came, but particularly you, Megan, for this presentation. It will be on SOL's website in a few days from now on, and it's a great resource. You can check it out. This topic and many others that have been covered in this year's ecological webinar series. Our next one that's coming up live will be in September 29th, I think, and it's another pollinator garden, but this time from Guelph, Ontario, on the grounds of a hospice in Guelph. So please join us then and check out our website and YouTube channel, and also the Edmonton and Area Land Trust, and great resources. Thank you very much for even just all of the tips that you provided, and a lot of us probably know some of that, but it's really important to keep in mind some of those practices, like best practices, to do this in a responsible way.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for having us to speak here. So.
Okay. No, we really appreciate it. And thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye. And yes, we will send a link to this presentation. Thanks for asking. We will do so. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.